So it's 1:15, so I'm going to start because I'm Swiss, so I like to start on time. I gave the same talk last week in Belgium, and I had like, I would say 15 times the crowd, maybe, something like that. So anyway, it's filmed, it will go on the net, so always good. Anyway, so my talk is titled Working Across the .NET Continuum. My name is Laurent Bugnon. I'm a senior user experience developer with MIX09, based in Zurich in Europe. The firm MIX09 is based in Tacoma and Seattle in the US. Here you have information about me. The easiest way to get in touch with me is to go to my website and my blog at galasoft.ch and identitymine.com. And here you have my Twitter handle, so don't hesitate to follow me. So what do I understand when I speak about the .NET Continuum? If we consider that from a user experience point of view, we can say that there is a graduation of user experience. And if we start at the bottom, we have ASP.NET, which is basically HTML and CSS and nothing else. So this is a very passive view. ASP.NET comes with different flavors. The most well-known in the moment is web forms. And at the time, Microsoft just released version 1 of another framework running on ASP.NET as well, called MVC, or Model View Controller. The MVC framework allows a better control over the HTML code which you create, which is sent to the web client. Also, it allows a better testability of your application. Now, so why do I put ASP.NET at the bottom of the user experience scale? Even though you have the full .NET, so you have a lot of functionality, it runs on the web server. So every time that an action must be done, you click on a link, and then there is a refresh of the whole page. So from a user experience perspective, it's not very good. You have to wait. If we go one notch higher, we have AJAX, which is short for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, which is actually not quite a good name because nowadays we rarely use XML for these kind of things. XML is a little bit a verbose protocol with a lot of lost bandwidth, basically. A lot of characters are transmitted which don't really bring information. So nowadays, we prefer to use another protocol called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Now, AJAX is a client made in JavaScript. So you have less power than with .NET, obviously. However, it runs on the client, so you can do some processing on the client without having to go back to the web server, which is an advantage. So it improves the user experience. Here, too, you have flavors. So you can program AJAX with the built-in objects. It's more or less standard, not in every browser exactly the same, which is why people usually prefer to use frameworks, for example, ASP.NET AJAX. And nowadays, a very popular framework to do AJAX is jQuery, which is not a Microsoft product. It's an open source product. But Microsoft is investing quite a lot into that and contributing in an open source manner to add functionality if needed. And they are, in fact, investing so much that they distribute the jQuery files, so those script files. When you create a new ASP.NET MVC application, you will get those files for free, but anyway, they are free. But they will be installed, pre-installed. Then, clearly, one notch higher, we have Silverlight, which is kind of a compromise of both solutions that we had before, because we have .NET, so you have more power, but it runs on the client, so you don't have all those constant refresh of the page and postbacks. Silverlight is not the whole .NET, so you have a little bit less functionality than with ASP.NET MVC, for example. However, it runs on multiple platforms. For example, on Windows, IE, Firefox, and if you go on Macintosh, Safari, Firefox, those are the browsers officially supported. They are a few more where it's known to work, and the version for Linux is coming soon. And then finally, on top of the user experience scale, you have Windows Presentation Foundation. So here we are not talking about web applications anymore. We are talking about rich desktop applications. And WPF can be deployed in multiple ways. One way to do that is an XBAP, which stands for XAML Browser Application. So this is something which is not very well known, but it can be useful if you have to run your application from the internet with limited permissions and in the web browser. So that's, again, a kind of web application, but you have the full .NET, so you can do some 3D and everything. XBAP run typically with less security, with less permissions than a standalone application. For example, you cannot save files locally, etc. If you want really to have a standalone application, one solution to deploy that I personally recommend is Click Once. This is a technology which is built in Visual Studio. You can create setup files and copy that to a web browser, to a web server. It also generates an HTML page for your user. The user can go to that page, click on Install, and the setup starts. It also has a few nice features, such as the possibility to set up that the application has to check for a new version every time that it is started, for example, or every time it is ended, or every 7 days. And you can even set that an update is marked as critical, meaning that it has to be installed, which is a nice way to fix critical bugs. Click Once has some limitation, however. You cannot write or read from the registry when you install a Click Once application. So you cannot install COM components such as ActiveX, etc. Finally, if you need really the whole range of functionality, you can always do a setup, such as an MSI, for example. Now, all those technologies here can communicate in a way or another with Windows Communication Foundation. And this is exactly the topic of this talk. And more especially, we will talk about ASP.NET MVC, about Ajax jQuery, Silverlight, and WPF Click Once. So before I jump to the demo, I just want you to picture the deployment picture, because this is very important to understand what is happening, because we will talk a lot about servers and clients, and in some cases it's not quite clear where, which server is where. So the Windows Communication Foundation box, this is a data server. Now, physically speaking, everything runs on this laptop. Okay, that's my development laptop. However, logically, this is really a completely separated machine. So we will have to deal with some problems like cross-domain communication and these kind of things. Then we have the web server, which is the component which delivers web content. And this web server, again, logically speaking, it's a completely separated machine. And then, coming from the web server, we have HTML solutions. In the case of ASP.NET MVC, we have Ajax, we have Silverlight. In addition to that, we have the WPF client, which is a standalone client, which doesn't use any web server. Okay? So we have a yellow box, a red box, and a few green clients. So let's see a demo now. So here I have a WCF service which I prepared. To host the WCF service, I chose an ASP.NET web application. And the reason for that is that I want to publish my WCF service on a web server. So this is a perfect host for that. You get a whole lot of configuration already out of the box. But you could also host WCF services, for example, as Windows services, as an application running in the background, or this kind of setup. Then I have my service, which is here. I will come to that in a moment. And I have an additional class, which is called Server Datetime Info. and which is marked as a data contract. This class, we will hear a lot about it in the demo. This is a class that I use as a container for information to pass data between the WCF server and the client. This class has 3 properties, which are marked as data members. So it means that these properties will be serialized. They will be passed to the client. So I have the date time on the WCF server. I have a string representing the culture, for example, EN-US for English US, or FR-FR for the French culture. And then I have a representation as a string of the current date time on the WCF server in the given culture. I have 2 constructors. The first one basically sets the properties. And then I have a default constructor, because this class being serialized, .NET requires a default constructor. The service itself, I chose a Silverlight-enabled WCF service. So why did I do that? Basically, it's the same as before because of configuration. So if you go here to add new item, and then you go to the Silverlight section, you have here Silverlight-enabled WCF service. Now, you could do all I do here with a normal WCF service and tweak the configuration. But by using a Silverlight-enabled WCF service, it's a perfect setting for the web, for HTTP binding, which we are going to use. So basically, you save some configuration effort. So let's take a look at the service. If I open here the implementation, I have 2 methods. The first one, and those methods are marked as operation contracts. This is important because you want to expose those methods in your service. So you have one which is getServerDateTime. It gets the current date and time. It creates one of the instances of this data contract class that we will use to pass information with the current culture. And then it returns this server datetime info instance to the client. The second one does pretty much the same, but in addition, it takes a culture string, which could be, for example, EN-US. I'm also going to sleep here for 5 seconds. This is just to simulate a longer request, for example, a database query, so that we can compare the way that all those clients are going to react. So now my service is ready, more or less, which means that I can test if it's configured properly. So to do that, you can go on the SVC file, right-click, View in Browser. This will start a web browser, a web server, which is in that case an ASP.NET development server. So this is distributed together with Visual Studio. And it runs at port 56-150. So this is actually the yellow box. Okay? So if everything went well and my service is configured properly, I have this page. Now, this page with the default configuration is actually perfect for rich clients, such as .NET-based client, because it uses a protocol which is named SOAP to communicate, which is quite a heavy protocol, which is a complete description of the web service, of the WCF service. So if you use a tool such as Visual Studio, you can actually use that description to create what we call a proxy, which is a client-side representation of the server-side object. Now, it's very easy to program against a proxy because you just call methods, and .NET is going to do all the heavy lifting, which is encoding the request, sending it, waiting for the response, getting the response, decoding the response, and giving you a .NET object. However, if you use Ajax, which is a very lean client, a very thin client, you don't really have the processing power for that. So we want to configure our service to give us JSON in addition to SOAP. And then we will choose which endpoint we will use. So as I said, this is just a matter of configuration. I don't change the implementation of my service. I will go to web config. Sorry. Here we go. And then if I scroll down, I have the service model section, which is where I want to work. I'm just going to open a snippet file to go a little bit faster. Here we go. So the first thing I want to do is add an endpoint behavior. The default behavior is the one which is giving us SOAP. So now I'm going to add here an additional behavior, which I name web behavior. It could be anything, and which uses web HTTP. So I'm preparing my service to accept pure HTTP requests, such as a GET. GET means you're just calling a URL, nothing else. Now I need to configure endpoints. So here I have the default endpoint. And just to make things a little bit clearer, I'm going to name it basic endpoint. This endpoint uses basic HTTP binding, which is a way to say, give me some SOAP content. And the contract that it uses, the class that it uses, is server datetime service, which is a service that we saw just before with the two methods. Now I want to add an additional endpoint, which is going to give me some JSON content. So this endpoint is named web endpoint. It could be anything. It runs at the address JSON. I will explain that in just a moment. It uses the web behavior that I just exposed. It uses web HTTP binding, which is a very lean way to communicate. But it calls the exact same implementation. So this is just an additional endpoint in parallel. Now I mentioned that it runs at the address JSON. So what you want to do here, when you type a URL, you want to add /JSON to specify that you want to use that particular endpoint. We will see that in just a moment. Before I can do that, however, I must specify which method is going to allow access through a GET. And this is done by adding an attribute called WebGet. So now I can build my service. And if I go here at the address /JSON, and then the name of the method, which is get server date time. And I don't have any parameter for this method. And if I load that, I get an XML representation of the server datetime class, the server datetime info class, which was marked as a data contract. Okay? That's the first time we see it. We will see it a lot. With the three properties. But we said that XML is not the best. So I'm going to change, to tweak the configuration, to actually return JSON. So you can here do that with the attribute. And I'm going to say that the response format equals web message format dot, and I have two values. The default is XML. I want to use JSON. Now I want to do the same for the second operation. And it's going to be just a little bit more complex because I have a parameter here. So what we do here is with this additional URI template parameter, we are also specifying a mapping, if you want, between the URI and the method. And we say every time that you have /JSON /get server datetime for culture, I could have chosen a shorter name here. It would have been wise, but let's just go with that. And then / and a string. This string will be interpreted as the culture string parameter. So now at this point, my service is ready to roll. So I'm going to start building some clients. The first client that I want to build is the ASP.NET MVC client. So I'm going to go here, add new project. This is a standard Visual Studio 2008 installation with 2 add-ons. I have the Silverlight Toolkit. It's not named Toolkit, it's named Software Development Kit, sorry, SDK, and the ASP.NET MVC SDK. So if you install that on the web, you get ASP.NET Web Application. Going to name that simply MVC and press OK. I'm not going to create a unit test project, and that's bad, okay? Because you want to do unit test, and that's a big value of MVC. But that's a very simple demo, so I'm not going to do that here. So now what happens is that I will have something running in the red box, in the web server. Here we go. So now I have a new project, which is actually a new web server, and I'm going to specify that as a startup project because this .NET Continuum, where the WCF service is just a data server. It's not running clients. So MVC, like the name says, stands for Model View Controller. So we have some controllers, and when we create a new MVC application, we get a default application, which we can modify and build on. This default application has, for example, a home controller. And the home controller has 2 methods, index and about. In MVC, we talk about actions. So what I want to, and then we have the view, the V, okay? So here, for each controller, I have a subfolder, for example, account or home, okay? By convention, we don't use a controller's suffix. And then for each action, I have a view, for example, about and index. And then MVC is going to do the mapping between the URL and what it needs to return for you. So now we want to add an action. Which is named server date time. So what this action does is create a new service datetime service client, server datetime service client. Now this client doesn't exist yet. This class is not available in the project, which is why I have those squiggly lines underneath. We will do that in a moment. Then I'm going, depending on the culture parameter, either call get server datetime on this client or get server datetime for culture. And those methods are the 2 methods that I had on the WCF server. Okay, so we have a proxy representation, a client-side representation of the server. Then I'm going to go into the server datetime info, which is again the data contract class that we are using to pass information. And I'm going to save those 2 properties into something called the view data, which is a collection. And the controller is communicating information to the view using this collection. So now I need to get a client. I need to get my proxy. So to do that, with Visual Studio, it's very comfortable. You can go right-click on Reference and choose Add Service Reference. Now, since my WCF service is running in the same solution, I can click on Discover. If it was not the case, I could just go and type a URI here. For example, if you have a production WCF server. Now, I'm going to expand this so that we see that all this information is getting downloaded from the WCF service. So here I have my contract with my 2 classes. I'm going to name that server date time service. Press OK. And what happens now is that those proxy objects are getting generated. So what Visual Studio does, it actually creates a new namespace. And we can see that because now if I go and click on that class, I have this small box which I can open, and I can add a new namespace to my using section. So now the compiler is happy. He knows those classes, including the data contract class, or rather the client representation of the data contract class. So at this time, I can build, and my controller is ready. So I could go and unit test that. But now I want to build the view. So the view is always named like the action. So I'm going to copy that, go in the home folder, which corresponds to the home controller, right-click, add view. I'm told it's slightly different in the release version of MVC, and this is a previous version, but you will find your way. I'm naming this view like the action, and click on Add. What is generated now is a partial view, because I'm using master page. So here into this content, I'm going to go and add some code. And now we see one particularity of ASP.NET MVC, which is that we mix HTML code and C# code, which kind of reminds us of what we did back then when we did classic ASP. But here we have one big advantage over classic ASP, which is that this code is C#, it's strongly typed, and it is compiler checked. Like, for example, this home controller class is not defined anywhere in this particular file. So the compiler protests. So what I can do, I can add a directive to my page, which is exactly the same as doing a using directive in C#. So I'm going to import the namespace mvc.controllers, and now my compiler is happy, and I have color coding. So now my view is ready. And by the way, before, remember, we were using a collection called view data to communicate information to my view. It's here. Okay? So I'm going to go and read the content. So before we test the view, I'm going to implement the AJAX solution so that we can compare the behavior. So I'm going to do the AJAX implementation into index.aspx, which is the default page for this solution. First, I'm going to add some code here. So since this is my default page, I'm going to use that first to go and trigger my MVC solution. And I do that using a helper class called helper method called html.actionLink, which is installed when you install the MVC. What this method does is create a link for you based on a number of information, like the text of the link, the controller, but here I'm using the home controller, which is a default, so I didn't specify it, and then the name of the action, plus possibly a collection of parameters. Then the second section is using AJAX to do the same. I'm going to use a JavaScript function which doesn't exist yet. We will do that in just a moment. And I also have a div here which requires, well, which asks the user to please wait, okay? So since here we don't have a refresh of the whole page, the page is not blocked, it's very nice because you can give information to your user about what is happening. So now let's implement the JavaScript for that page. The first thing I have is a reference here. I'm importing the jQuery JavaScript files, which are, as I said, pre-installed when you create a new MVC application inside the script folder. Then I have this function. And this function needs a URL because I'm here. So now I'm here into this green box, and I'm going to jump over the web server and go directly to call the WCF server. So I need the URL of the WCF server. And we have it. It's here. And don't forget to take the JSON, because or else you will get some SOAP content, which doesn't help you. Not for JavaScript, at least. Then, depending on the culture, I will call either getServerDatetime for culture slash the culture string, en-us, for example, which is what we did before when we configured the service. We had a URI template to do a mapping, or the default method. And then I'm adding here a dummy parameter, which is kind of a trick because I don't want to go and hit the web browser cache, because I'm asking a date time. So I want to refresh every time. I want to make sure that I'm hitting the WCF server every time. So this dummy parameter is going to change every time that I call the function. So like this, I bypass the cache and I go directly to the WCF server. Then we are going to use jQuery to show the please wait message. And then we are going to use a great function of jQuery, which is called getJSON, which does all the work for you. So you don't even have to worry about serializing and deserializing your JSON. What you get, so this method is asynchronous, by the way. And what you get here is the callback. So this code here will get called when the JSON content comes back from the WCF server. And what you get is really an object. That's a JavaScript object. So I can dot into the object. And we have properties, datetime representation, and culture, which means that this result object is actually a JavaScript representation of my server datetime info class, which is marked as data contract, again. And then I'm going to hide the please wait message. So now I'm ready. Let's go and start the MVC application. You see that another development server is started. That's the red box. We had the yellow box. It's still running. We can see it here. That's the yellow box, and that's the red box. So logically, they are totally separated. So here we go. Now we have 3 links, which are actually going to call the MVC solution. And remember, I have a 5 seconds delay. So if I click here, my page is blocked for 5 seconds. I cannot do anything, because my whole page is going to be refreshed anyway. But it works. I get the date and time formatted as French. Wait, it only gets better. Since I don't want to wait 5 seconds, I have the Ajax implementation. And here it's nicer. It's also going to take 5 seconds to have the request. But during this time, I have a nice information. And I can continue to interact with my page. And here we get the date and time formatted as Italian. So now let's see how to do that in Silverlight. So I'm going to add, again, another project here. I'm going to choose a Silverlight application and just name that project Silverlight. The next dialog asks me if I want to link this Silverlight application with a web server. So let's go back to that. Remember that Silverlight runs here, but it has to be delivered from a web server. So I want to use this red box, which is my client application server, if you like. Here, the yellow one, I don't want to use that. That's just a data server. So I'm going to use here the MVC, ASP.NET Web Application. And when I click on OK, what happens in Studio is that it's going to generate a new Silverlight application, and it's going to create a link between that application and the ASP.NET MVC web server. We can see this link because if I build my empty Silverlight application, here I have a new folder which was generated. By default, it's named client bin. And you have a silverlight.xap. That's an, I think it's XAML application, which is actually nothing else than a zip file containing the Silverlight DLLs, the assemblies, and some meta information which is needed to run the application. Now, Silverlight by itself, and I'm talking here about Silverlight 2, runs into a browser. You had the out-of-browser experience, right? So I'm talking about Silverlight 2. You have to have a browser. So you have to have a web page. This web page was also generated here. And this web page contains, this is a host for my Silverlight content. So now let's implement the Silverlight application. If I go here and open page.xaml, which is my front end for my UI, I'm going to make a very simple UI. Going to set the click event to a new event handler, and I'm going to give that a name because I want to be able to access that easily from the code later. Then I'm going to navigate to the event handler, and now what I need is a client, a proxy, to call my WCF server, same as before. So we know how to do that. Let's just go on the references folder, add service reference, discover. I'm going to name that server date time service. Now we know what happens. Okay, the information is downloaded, the proxies are generated. And then I get a new namespace. So I can type var client equals new. And here is my new namespace. Let's dot into that. And we see that we have a client. Remember, we want to use SOAP because Silverlight is .NET. We have power. Okay? So I will call the basic endpoint. And now I can go and dot into my client. And I see that I have my two methods, getServerDateTime and getServerDateTime for culture, with the async suffix. So in ASP.NET MVC, we didn't have the async suffix. The reason is that we used a synchronous way to call the WCF service. But in Silverlight, you may not do that. You can only call an a web WCF service asynchronously. Okay? That's a small restriction, which actually makes sense, if you like, because you don't want to block your user interface while the request is executed. Remember the 5 seconds. Huh? We don't want to block everything. So since it's asynchronous, I have a completed event handler, which is going to be called when the information comes back from the WCF server. So I'm typing plus equals, tab. Oops, interesting. Never had that error before, so let's try again. Plus equals, tab. Nope. That's funny. You had that before, Jonathan? Where is he? Never, huh? OK. So, great. Who remembers the signature? Oops. OK, so I'm just going to try that. Oh, you know what? I can do. Yeah, let's do something. Let's do a trick. I'm going to do a lambda expression like this. I don't need to know the type. I'm sorry, this is totally unexpected. So I'm going to actually say, I know that I have 2 parameters. So I'm just going to make a lambda expression. I'm going to say the first one is actually the sender. And the second one is E, which is an argument getting the result. And then I'm going to use that. Here we go, and this is my callback here, okay? Normally, this is not really the way that you do things, but I don't want to go and check in the documentation what is the type of those guys. So now I can say here, my button dot content equals E dot. I have here a nice result property, and result, it's a little bit small, but the type is server datetime info, again, data contract. So I can dot into that and get the datetime representation. So now what I need to do is call the method, because here I didn't call it. I just defined what happens when it comes back. So client dot async. And now I did something cool last time when I presented that. I was in Belgium, so I used NL-BE, which is funny because nobody can pronounce that except Belgian people, apparently. So my Silverlight application is done. OK, I cannot use E because I'm inside this method, so I'm just going to call that arg. Here we go. So the reason I cannot use E is because I'm local here, and I already have a variable called E here. But again, normally it's not how you do things. So now I can build. OK. So now I'm going to start my Silverlight application. And to do that, I started from the MVC server. I started from the red box, okay? So let's just click on View in Browser. And Silverlight allows a much richer user experience. And I'm sure that the designers on the front row are going to cringe. But anyway, I have just a very simple UI here. So we will see a little bit nicer UI later. I have just a big button. Now, if I click on that button, I have an exception. So what is the problem here? Well, basically, it's a problem of security. The problem is, I'm just going to say break and stop. So let's go back to this deployment guy. So I have my green Silverlight application, which is served from this red box. And this red box, I told you, logically speaking, it's a separate machine. And my Silverlight application wants to call the yellow box directly. And that's forbidden in Silverlight. You cannot do that. It's called cross-domain access, and you need to get permissions to do that. Now, thankfully, it's very easy to set up permissions on your WCF server. And by the way, Flash has exactly the same problem. Okay, so Flash can also not access cross-domain servers, except if a permission is configured. To set the permission, you have to add an XML file to the root of the server exposing the service. So I prepared such a file, so I'm going to choose Add Existing Item. And this file is called Client Access Policy. So let's see how it looks like. In that case, this is a production file. This is a development file. That's not a production file. So it allows everything. Okay? I'm allowing any header. I'm allowing any URI. So basically, any Silverlight application may call that service. And it can access the path, the root of the WCF server, including any subpath. So everything is open. Now, when you publish your WCF service to a real production server, you want to restrict that. Okay? You don't want to open everything. Flickr, for example, is configured to allow Silverlight applications to access certain services. So that's a handy way to configure that. So now I can go back here. Just going to refresh to be sure that everything is OK. And now if I click on the button, I see that during those 5 seconds, my UI continues to react. And after 5 seconds, I get Dom the dog, which is a Belgian way to say Thursday, I guess. Huh? Yeah. So it works. So now let's do the same in WPF. And I'm sorry it's going to be a little bit, even though WPF, like everybody knows, Jonathan, right, is so much better. No, it's just a private joke. So it's going to be a little bit boring because it's more of the same. So I'm going to add a new application, new project. This time I choose Windows WPF application. Here we go. The UI, I'm going to reuse the exact same code that I did in Silverlight. Here we go. I'm going to go to the event handler. And now we know the drill. Okay, I need a reference to my WCF service. So add service reference, discover. I will name that server date time service. I'm not very original. Download, proxy generation, new namespace. So now I can go and create my client, which is going to use the basic endpoint. And now if I dot into this client, I see that I have my 2 methods, but they don't have the async suffix. Okay? Those are synchronous methods, because remember, WPF has a whole .NET, in the contrary of Silverlight. So in Silverlight, you have only asynchronous. In WPF, you have both, but by default, only the synchronous is generated. It's not a big deal. It's easy to change it. You just go to your service reference, right-click, configure. And here you can check that box to generate the asynchronous operations. By the way, let's make just a small break. When you publish your WCF service on your production server, you want to change this URI here, because this is the address of the WCF service. Okay? So typically, you will have a www.something.com/whatever. I close the break. So now I say OK, and my asynchronous methods are getting generated. So now I can dot into that, and I get my completed event. Still doesn't work. Not a big deal. I'm going to do the same as before, as arg. Oops. Here we go. And here the code is the same as before. mybutton.content equals arg.result.datetime representation. And now I still have to call my method. OK, shout me a culture. Who knows I don't know, whatever culture code you like. fr.-ca, that's for our French-Canadian friend, right? OK, here we go. So now I can go set this WPF application as startup, because remember, I don't have a web server anymore. Here, I'm running that in standalone. Start this. I get the same UI as before, which is basically a big button. Click me. The UI continues to react. It's a little bit subtle, but it actually does react. 5 seconds later, we get the date. You don't use the name of the... That's interesting. Normally, you have the name of the day. Like for here, we had Thursday Z, and here, apparently, they don't. So that's a difference. I didn't know that. OK. So now we saw the continuum of the client applications. So let's recapitulate. So at first, we had a Windows Communication Foundation server and a web server. And this web server was delivering some HTML code and CSS, which was just a passive page. So every time we want to call the Windows Communication Foundation service, we have to refresh the page. We go through the web server. Now, if we do that with Ajax, we can actually access the Windows Communication Foundation server with a thin layer of formatting, which is a JSON content. Now, I wrote same domain. It's a little bit tricky in Ajax, and it's quite complex, actually. My web server and my WCF server, I told you those are two separate machines. Now, here it works because both of them run on local host. So Ajax doesn't care about the port. Silverlight does. In addition to being really different, it depends on which browser, web browser, you run your Ajax application, which is really annoying. In IE, typically you will get a prompt. So the user will have to confirm, yes, I allow this application to access my other WCF server. In some cases, it doesn't work at all. And you never know. So if really you have your WCF server on a separate machine in a separate domain, you probably rather want to do a gateway through your web server. The web server, it's OK. He has the full .NET, so he can do anything he wants. Okay? But from Ajax, it might be tricky. So be careful with that. Now, with Silverlight, it's really much, much easier because it's always the same. No surprises there. You can access the WCF server if it's the same domain and the same port. It's quite restrictive. Or if you have a policy file in place, the client access policy. And here, too, the behavior is always the same on every platform, so no surprises. If you don't have a policy file, then you still have the solution of making a gateway through your web server. In WPF, no web server, you have the full power of .NET, so you can access Windows Communication Foundation directly. So now I'm going to show you an application which is built according to the same principles, but which is a little bit more complex and does more things. But before we do that, I just want to say a few words about the user interface pattern, which is used a lot, called the view model pattern. It's used a lot with Silverlight and WPF. We had a workshop on Tuesday afternoon, which was a very long workshop, very advanced, and we talked a lot about MVVM. I believe that this workshop was filmed, so if you can grab the video, it's very rich in educational stuff. If you cannot get that, you just go to Live Search or whatever search engine you like, and you enter model view model pattern or just view model pattern. You will find a lot of information about that. So the problem here, when we have Windows Communication Foundation with data, we want to pass the data to Silverlight or WPF. Now, since you have .NET, you could think, OK, I have some SOAP or some JSON content or some XML content, whatever. I can go and parse my data directly and extract the information, but nobody likes to do that. It's very easy to make errors, and it's long. So instead, we use proxies, which is what we do when we add a service reference. Okay? Those proxies are .NET objects generated for you. So when you have a UI, you can directly, in Silverlight and WPF, we use data binding a lot. You can directly data bind to your proxy. Okay, you will get your UI updated and everything. But the problem is that you cannot extend the proxy with additional functionality, because this proxy is generated. Any code that you add into that will be erased the next time that you build. So instead, what we do is add an additional layer, and we call that layer the view model. And we then bind the UI to that view model. Okay? So let's see the other demo. So here I have another WCF service with, by the way, a unit test project. And this WCF service is built and configured exactly the same way than I did before. So I have my two endpoints. This service is actually published on my web server on internet. And I like risks, so I'm going to actually call the web server. And I have an XML file on that web server which contains information about a list of customers. First name, last name, address, account number, gender, and a path to a picture. The pictures are also published on the WCF server. Here they are. Then I built an application, or rather a series of applications like we just did. I have an MVC application, a Silverlight application, and a WPF one. So first, let's start with the MVC application. And by the way, here I combined MVC and Ajax, because this is what you want to do usually. You want to have the web server, the ASP.NET power on the web server, creating ASP.NET MVC code. And then you want to add some Ajax to that to have an enhanced user experience. Okay, both live very well together. So let's go and see the customer list. Yep. I will show that. I show that in just a moment, yeah. So the question was if I'm going to show how to share files between projects, and I'll do that in just a moment. So here I have my page. So this is my view, which was built in ASP.NET MVC. I have here the list of customers. So that's a representation of my XML file. Now, to enhance the user experience, I added some Ajax code, some JavaScript code. Like when I click on my name, my pictures is fetched from the server, but I don't refresh the whole page. And that's me. You always have to show your children when you give a presentation. That's Anders Helsberg, the creator of C#, said that, so I obey. Cathy Kam, because I needed to have a female, we'll see later why, a woman. She's from the Silverlight team at Microsoft. We have Dr. WPF. Who knows Dr. WPF? Raise hand. Wow, cool. In Belgium, nobody knows him. But anyway, so he's here too. And then the rest are some friends from the WPF Disciple mailing list. That's a group on Google where there's a lot of nice information about WPF. And they agreed to let me use their, I think Sasha is great. They agreed to let me use their details for this application. Now I also have another functionality, which is I can change the name of a user, of a customer. For example, my married name is Bunyon-Ang because my wife is Chinese. So if I save the last name, please wait. Okay? We see that without a refresh of the page, I have the name was updated. And if I go on my web server, in Belgium it's better because you say on my web server in the US, which adds, it's grand, right? But here it doesn't work the same. Anyway, let's just refresh that, and I see that the file has been updated. So if you have a database, for example, it would be updated directly. So that's cool. Now let's see the Silverlight experience. So here I have a totally different look and feel, because in Silverlight I can do whatever I want, basically. Okay? And if I was a designer, it would be pretty. I'm not. I can go and load my customers. I have a small animation here, so this is asynchronous. And I have a nicer UI because, for example, I added the small picture here on the users. I added more information because with data binding, it's really easy to do. My account number is visible. I use the same picture here, and here I added what we call an opacity mask, which is a way to crop a picture very easily. Also works for videos, which allows really cool effects. And I can also go and filter by name, which is just a feature that I added. And here I added a small delay like this. We can see that this animation is actually working, so I don't block my UI. And I have my two daughters. The color of the brush is linked to the gender of the person. So I'm just going to reload everything. And Dr. WPF, when he sees this demo, he really wants to change his name to Dr. WPF-Silverlight. Here I don't need to press on any button. I just exit the text box. And remember, I have my view model, so I was able to add a function which calls the WCF server to save. So if I go here and refresh that, where is Dr. WPF? Here. Okay, so it worked. The user experience is nicer. I don't need to click. Now let's see WPF. I made a click once application, which means that I can install it locally. I have a shortcut in my start menu. Here we go. Now I added a request that the application must check the server every time if there is a new version. So this is the experience that you will get if you do that. And then I get my WPF application, which looks exactly the same as my Silverlight application, except that I can drag it, and I have transparency. This is just small things that I added. If I press on load, I'm not sure why every time I run this application, it takes a little bit longer. I think it's time to reformat my box. That's a Windows 7 box. I'm going to blame that on Windows 7. Anyway, we will see that there is also the small animation, and there is the exact same look and feel. I will come back to that when it's finished loading. So how can I create this exactly same look and feel? Well, basically, I'm sharing a lot of code. So remember, I have a view model. So let's go and see. Here I have this folder with 3 files, which are actually containing this view model, this additional layer. Okay, so I have my customer proxy object, which is then encapsulated or layered into a customer view model object. And those 3 files are actually shared into here. Let me try to zoom. Okay. So now we see that it's shared because I have here a small icon, which is a link, a shortcut. Those 3 files don't exist physically in my application. They are linked. I can also create a link to a user control. Okay, like this please wait animation, which is turning, is developed as a user control. It's here, and I created a link here. So I'm using the same code exactly. Now, if you want to do that, it's actually quite easy. You can add an existing item, choose any file that you want, and instead of pressing on add, you click here and you choose add as a link. Okay, that's the trick. The rest of the code is not shared. It's actually, I copy and paste, and then I had to tweak a little bit. I would say that 80% at least of my XAML code is the same. 100% of my view model code is the same. So you see that you want to put as much code as possible in the view model. Okay? And the rest is proxy, it's generated. So of course, you don't care. I'm slightly above time, but we have question and answer. I just want to show you something which is pretty cool. I think it's really worth to do that. If I open my main view model, which is a view model for the whole window, I can actually, for my designers, create some design time data. The problem being, if I have a list box with a list of customers, when I do work in expression blend, blend is not able to connect to the WCF service. So I will have an empty list box. And it's quite hard to design against nothing, right? So here I can, as a developer, add some code. I'm just going to go and check here if I'm running into blend or no. If I'm not running into blend, I'm going to create my client and wire the event handlers. If, however, I run into blend, I'm going to create 10 dummy customers, design time customers. And then, when I go into blend, I see my dummy customers. So, and I did even better. I selected in code the number 2, which is, by chance, it's a girl. It's actually calculated randomly. So I have my pink brush. Okay? So now, as a designer, I can go and edit the template. I have actual data that I can work against. So that's another advantage of the view model pattern. Yeah, so this one died. I'm sorry. I tried 15 times. It worked. And now it died. But anyway, that's the same look and feel, so it would be pretty boring, right? OK. So let's go back to the PPT. So in conclusion, it was pretty intense, right? We saw a lot of code. We saw some servers, some clients. It's not very easy to remember where is what. So I recommend to you download the video. It will be published soon. And you will also have the whole code. I'm not sure if there is a place on Visit Mix to post that, but at least on my blog it will be available. I will also post some walkthrough to explain to you exactly what I did here. Okay? I want to thank you for your attention. Sorry for the small problems I had. I'm not sure what was wrong. There is a mic in the middle of the room. If you have questions, please go to the microphone and ask them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, yeah, sorry. Before we start the questions, please fill your evaluation forms. I'm required by law to say that. Please.
How you doing? I actually had a question about your communication foundation. You were showing how you can, we knew this was available by making it where you can add a contract and giving the option for JSON. So what happens if I have a service application that I want to make available to other customers that may have a preference on REST or SOAP or whatever? I'm under the, I think I understand it when you were showing like what type you wanted to pump out, whether it was JSON or XML. But can I actually use Windows Communication Foundation to make my objects available into whatever the customer wants without me having to spend a lot of code? I don't have to make those attributes that say this one's in JSON or this one's in...
Yeah, that's a good point. there are some discussion about that. Attributes are a little bit controversial because even though it's meta information, you need to compile the code, right?
Yeah.
Which is a kind of, I mean, we could argue it's a weakness of this model. I don't have a better answer than that. I have to add a small disclaimer. I'm not a WCF specialist,
okay.
so it's possible that there is a better way to do that.
Okay. Okay.
If there is, I didn't find it. Okay, I'm rather a client application developer.
Okay.
However, I think that's pretty much the way to do it.
Okay.
So yeah, the problem is really between JSON and XML, basically, if you want to toggle here. Okay. I don't know if anybody knows if there is a better way to do that in the room. Okay, so I recommend you to check maybe with WCF experts. It's possible that there is a better way.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Cool. Hi.
Hello. Excellent session.
Well, thank you very much.
We're trying to get heavily into the MVVM as well.
Yep.
One thing I'm struggling with, because the reason we want to do it is for unit testing primarily.
Exactly.
I have not figured out an elegant way to mock up data to mimic the service
Yep.
in the Silverlight client
Yep.
application. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how to, I guess, abstract away the proxy reference
Yeah.
via an interface.
Yeah, so typically you want to mock your service. So typically you want to download a mock framework of your choice. Do you know mocking? Okay. Yeah, well, normally here in the case of the Silverlight-enabled WCF service, okay, you don't have an interface, but normally WCF services are actually declared using an interface, and this interface is a contract for your service, right? So the way mocking works is by reading that and by creating an object for you which implements the interface, which is a mock object. So what you probably want to do if you want to really mock your object is use that way of declaring your WCF service. So not the Silverlight-enabled WCF service, which just gives me a little bit pre-configuration, but it's no big deal, okay? And then you use the actual way of declaring a WCF service, which has an interface for the contract, and then an implementation, and then that you can mock quite easily, okay? And then you will get dummy data from your mock service, okay? So I would probably do that this way. Another way is, of course, you know, if you have an interface, you can create your own. You don't need to use a mock framework if you don't want. You can create your own implementation. It's just a little bit more work, but then you get the data exactly as you want them. Okay? Cool. Any additional questions? Okay, so session dismissed. Thank you very much, and have a good end of MIX.